after an awakening, we hit an unraveling. An unraveling time period is like an autumn. And during an autumn time, that's when you have your harvest. That's when there's real abundance. You plant your seeds in the spring. In the summertime, you nurture, plenty of sun, plenty of everything so that things can really grow. And in the autumn time is where you have abundance. And abundance in the unraveling is usually a time period when people really, just after the awakening, they're getting into themselves, getting into their inner world. And then after that, they're really getting into themselves in a very kind of narcissistic, hedonistic way. Unravelings are probably the most fun time of an entire cycle. We're talking about the 80s and the 90s. Here in Ireland, it'd be the late 80s to the middle 00s. A time of abundance, a time where people are really out for themselves, they're really having fun, new kinds of crazy music, and a lot of individualism, there's still a lot of searching with the inner self, but it's more for trying to get ahead in life, more for an individual kind of trying to build oneself up and get ahead in life. And you have to understand that during an unraveling, because this is an autumn-like season, there's an abundance around. For the last 20 years, how many times have we heard the word abundance? How often do we hear about abundance and how much abundance is out there and how you can get your piece and you know, the catalog of the universe and everything that you've heard for the last 20 years comes during a time period when there is an abundance, when there is a sense of, look, you can really go for your highest potential in what you can do. Society seems okay. Look, in the last 20 years, there's hardly any protests. In the last 20 years, there's financial abundance in everybody. That doesn't mean that poverty was eradicated, but for the last 20 years, you could really indulge yourself. And we have. The problem is, a season must come to an end. And when you have a time period when there's a collective indulgence going on, and now we're moving to the other end where the collective doesn't really matter anymore. For the last 20 years, it's all been about the individual. Community has not mattered as much. Collective protest, it's not really a big deal. We're too busy having fun. And we have had fun. This is a time where you can really discover what it is that you can do on a personal level in life. This is a time period where you can feel your individual self strongly. You don't have to feel that you have to participate. And in fact, in the last 20 years, if you were to compare a time during the high where people were getting out of college and they wanted to go to work for some big company, most people back in the 40s and 50s were not really thinking about getting out and being entrepreneurs. In the last 20 years, we've had lots of entrepreneurs. Everybody wants to start their own little thing because it's a time period where you can. This is the time period that we just came out of. And the reason why this is so important for me to share with you tonight is because we have come out of it. How many times do I see, stoners from the 60s that think they're still in the 60s? They can't let it go. It's like watching someone walking around in the wintertime with a bikini because they can't let go of winter. I mean, they can't let go of summer. They just love summer so much. They just refuse to take the bikini off, and it's freezing outside. So some people can get stuck in certain time periods. Some people don't want this unraveling to end. Some people don't want to face the fact that we are at the beginning of a crisis. Our spiritual winter has arrived, was the title of the last discussion I gave last year. Not that many people showed up. Because nobody really wanted to hear that. More people are showing up now, even though I didn't use that title. It would suggest to Tino, do not use that title again. You don't want to hear about spiritual winters and crisis mode and everything. But we are a year deeper into this. The crisis season began at the end of 2000. At the end, practically in the middle of 2008, housing market started falling apart, Lehman Brothers, all this stuff. Exactly the same thing that happened in 1929. We are back full circle. And exactly 80 years ago, they spent the year talking about how, oh, we got this. We're going to bail banks out and we're going to recover. We're going to bounce back. And it didn't happen. It kept getting worse and worse. So people who are still stuck in the last season are going to have a difficult time going through this season. So I'm hoping to share with you tonight the idea that prepare yourself for this season. Because nature and the divine does not make things to simply punish you. You can learn a lot in these next 20 years, and it will be the next 20 years that we will continue to go through this. I'm prepared for it. I see the upside of it. I see the positive of it. I see the good things of it. A lot of people don't, because they still want to be stuck in the last 20 years. They don't want to let go of their dreams. Perhaps they didn't pull it off. Perhaps it didn't go as well as they hoped. Or perhaps it fell apart, as things tend to do when you think things are going to continue on a linear mode. That we can just keep going on in this way. A lot of us knew that this couldn't possibly happen. And just like in the 1920s, when people were shouting at the top of their lungs, everything's going to fall apart, and they were swept under the rug, discredited, and made to look like fools. And then when the crisis did happen, they were swept further under the rug. So there have been people in the last several years who've been saying, hey, alarms, alarms here, this is not possibly sustainable. And the interesting thing is that we somehow know that these seasons are happening. We somehow know. We don't know how we know. It's just like winter's coming and it's getting a little bit colder. It's a little bit more obvious. But I think in the last several years, people have known something is just not right about this. Just like people knew in the 60s and 70s, whoa, something's changing here. The music's different. People are dressing different. And people knew in the 80s and 90s, this is very different. Music was very different. You know, our lifestyles were very different. The way we dress is very different. So we know something is changing, but we tend not to look at the idea that we are going through some kind of rhythmic pattern that we go through in a lifetime. We always think it's our generation. We always think it's just this once this once unique moment. It's unique for us. And the thing that I like to do is, rather than, because a lot of people think of circular, and I'd like to differentiate between circular and cyclical. Because circular gives you the impression that you're going to be back to the same point. You start here, you go around, and you're back to the same point. Obviously in history that's not true. This isn't the 1920s or the 30s. We got different technologies. We got different things that are going on. So I like to think of cyclical as being kind of more spiral. You're back at the same point, but it's a little bit higher. We're at a different time period now. And we'll go back around, and it'll be a little bit higher. But these same exact things happen as we go around. If all you have to do is go back to the 1910s and 20s, and you will find what you found in the last 20 years. Angel books, self-help books, all kind of gurus and all kinds of people with risky investments, housing markets go up and everything. These things happen because they're part of the season. It's part of what happens during the season. So we have just come out of this unraveling. And one of the reasons why it is an unraveling is because whatever was built up after the last crisis as institutions, whatever is not sustainable starts to fall apart. So our banking industry, our housing market, the unraveling is a time when what you have built up, if it is not sustainable, it will start to crumble and fall apart. So that's why we've had what we've had, and why we are entering into what we are entering, a crisis period. And in a crisis period, as leaves are falling from a tree, so too are institutions falling apart if they are not sustainable. And they have to. Why would we want to? And unfortunately, that's what we're doing. We keep pushing it. We keep pushing it. Let's just keep... You know what? Earlier today, I just imagined the crisis that we were going through financially, housing, or whatever the case may be. I just imagined a car driving down the road, and suddenly a boulder just comes, boom, and it crashes into the boulder. And here you have behind the boulder presidents and prime ministers and finance ministers saying, if we just push a little bit harder, the car can get going again. Instead of saying, look, it is... I was about to curse there. Let it go. This thing is done. But they'll keep getting behind it and saying push and push, and there'll be people that go push. Why? Because we want to go back. We want to have our indulgences. We want to believe that this is just a temporary little blip, and we can go back to how things were. It's not the way it's going to work. We do ourselves a lot more good if we could just accept that we are in a new season, and that it is time to change our behavior, change our mentality, and let fall apart what needs to fall apart. This is an extremely great time for people who have ideas. The crisis time is a wonderful time for people who have ideas who would have not been heard during an unraveling, during the last 20 years. Entrepreneurs, people with skills that we've taken for granted. I mean, we don't even know where our clothes come from. Who knows how to... I can't sew clothes. I can't put my clothes together. But there are these kinds of things going on. And I have an ear to these things because I'm aware of what's going on. I'm aware of what season we're in. So I have friends telling me that they have... My friend was just telling me that someone just recently did like a stitch-up workshop where you can bring in old clothes and kind of stitch them up, but kind of dress them up a little bit, put a little bit different style on it. It's wonderful. That's what happens during a crisis time. That idea now has, because we have to start depending more on our community, on local. We don't even know where our food comes from, where our shoes are being made, because we're not making them. During an unraveling, you can sit back on your bean bags and get comfortable. Because other parts of the world who are not going through an unraveling are making our things for us. We like to indulge ourselves during that time. But during an unraveling, one of the great things that you can learn is how to be an individual, how to survive on your own. In many cases, you have to. During an unraveling, a lot of people disengage from big institutions because it's kind of like, you guys are getting too big. I'm just like a little ant. So I'm going to find a way to survive outside of this. So we have a lot, in the last 20 years, a lot of pirates, bootleggers, hackers. That's what comes out. When people can't, when it gets so difficult to get into the institutions, it gets so difficult to get into certain corporations, or it gets so difficult to get into certain markets, you start creating another market. You start finding clever ways, and this last 20 years has had a whole entire generation of people who have come up with clever ways to do things differently. To kind of look for the niche, to kind of look for the way that you can kind of get around, make some shortcuts. That's what's happened in the last 20 years. Those kind of people will now have ideas of how we're going to survive this crisis, because they didn't become too dependent on society and the institutions. So the crisis time is what we are beginning with now. This crisis time has begun, will continue, and there are some downsides to it, and there are some upsides to it. If we look at the last crisis period, some pretty terrible things happened. We had Germany, we had World War II, we had the Great Depression. Hey, crisis times take us to the point of having to be face to face with what we have done that is not sustainable. If you go back 80 years and you see what happened and what unfolded during those 20 or 2 decades, some pretty troubling things can happen. Not everyone's going to survive a winter. You know, winter season, you really got to be prepared. You really got to hope that you have things in place that will help you get through the winter. Or we'd be in trouble if we didn't have some kind of heating system here in Ireland. But we do. A lot of times we take these things for granted. But if you go back 80 years before that, what did you have in Ireland? 1940s. The famine. Could the famine have happened in the last 20 years during an unraveling? No way. Why did it happen then? And it's definitely not because of potatoes. There was a whole lot more that was involved in that. And anyone who knows Irish history knows there's a whole lot more involved than just potatoes not growing well. It was political. It was the climate of things that were going on outside of Ireland as well. The embargoes of food not being let into the country. Those people didn't have to die. But this country was not prepared after an unraveling during a crisis period to deal with that crisis. In the United States, it was the Civil War. 80 years back. Before the crash, you go back 80 years, you got the Civil War. You go back 80 years, you have the American Revolution. You go back 80 years, you have the Glorious Revolution. These are 80-year cycles. These are real things that I'm talking to you about. This isn't some fantasy theory from my mind. Historians are really working on this stuff. I'm learning from masters who have taken a lot of time to really look at these rhythms and give them in a practical sense, instead of just this, maybe this kind of floaty, wavy. No, this is real stuff. And it happens. And so the more we can look at the realism of what is happening, the more we can prepare ourselves for it. What I like spending my time doing now is studying the 30s. How did people get through it? What were some good ideas that they used to get through it? How did certain people get successful? What was really going on with the different generations? And that leads into the next part of this. What creates these? It's not a timeline. It's not December, January, and it's wintertime. This is something different. There's an energy behind it. This is why my theme for tonight is the energies of life. Because there's human energy behind these unravelings. These generational shifts come from generations. From human beings who go through a particular time period and have a particular mindset that creates these particular seasons. So it's not solidly 80 years, but you kind of round it off. The lifetime span of a human being should be about 80 years. Not everyone makes it to 80, but everyone would make it, a lot of people make it to 60, so that's the beginning of, if we're looking at 20-year periods, let's say you're born in the high, you reach the age of 20 during an awakening, you reach the age of 40 during an unraveling, and you reach the age of 60 during a crisis. So most people get to see all 4 phases of life. The difference is, not everyone sees the 4 phases in the same way. What's creating these seasons? Generations. Generations of people. Collective generations. Now I want you for the moment to kind of try to back away from yourself. Don't look at this as archetypes of your individual self and say, oh no, those characteristics don't fit. It's not about you. It's about a collective generation and what that generation goes through and what the mindset of that generation is and what that generation does collectively. The first generation is the prophet generation, which is born during a high. The prophet generation is the generation of people who are practically perfectly aligned with the life cycle in how they go through life. If you think of the high as childhood and an awakening as rising adulthood, an unraveling midlife, and a crisis elderhood, these were known to the Greeks. They actually named these in four stages. When they talked about a person's lifetime, they talked about childhood, adulthood, midlife, elderhood. The Romans, same thing. Pythagoras did the same thing. These things have been known. That we have these kind of generations and that these generations have characteristics. So the prophet is the one generation that actually matches perfectly with all of the seasons. It's born during the spring, it's young adulthood during the summer, it's midlife during an unraveling in autumn and harvest time, and it finishes his life in elderhood during a crisis. The prophet generation is born during a high. It's born during a time when the crisis is over. So they're very idealistic. They have a great childhood. They tend to have a great childhood because the crisis is over. And so now is a time for rebuilding. So they're taught and they are given the sense that they can be idealistic. You can do what you want. You can build, we're building new institutions. So these children are given a lot of freedom to go out and play, to explore life. When they reach the awakening in their 20s, then they become a little bit challenging. Because what the previous generation doesn't realize, and again, I have to go through the cycle. I have to it's hard to find a starting point if you don't understand that the prophet generation was raised by the parents who went through the crisis. Now, parents who went through the crisis, they now have children, and they're so happy that the crisis is over that they give their children a lot of freedom. People who went through the crisis, there's a level of suffocation that children go through because it's dangerous out there. There's all kinds of things going on. You don't know where your money's coming from. You don't know where you're going to eat. You know, the depression, unemployment, all of these things. Now that it's over, children are given a sense of optimism to say, wow, you don't know anything about hard times, and we don't want you to know about hard times. So these children grow up with a sense of idealism about life. Problem is, when they reach their 20s, they see parents that don't challenge anything.